What's up everybody, it's Connor from T-Sportline. Today we're going to be installing the worn Zeon 12 winch on our Tesla Cybertruck with the CTX bumper. We're looking to do some serious off-roading with our Tesla Cybertruck, and what better than a winch for recovery gear? So let's get into the install. So your kit's going to come with your worn winch as well as your remote for the winch, a fair lead. This is a roller style. We're using a steel cable winch. The synthetic winches would have a non-roller style fair lead. You'll also have your winch hook and a negative ground strap for your winch, and you'll have your power wire already hooked up to your winch controller here. Additionally, Warren will send you with some hardware. We will be using 4 of the nylock nuts for this install. T-Sportline is going to also provide you with some relocation parts for your winch fitting into the CTX bumper. A couple of those are going to be these 4 bolts here that are going to mount the winch to the bumper. You'll also have a plug relocation harness with a solder joint for that harness, as well as the worn Zeon relocation kit. We also provide a little bit of wire sheathing for routing these wires around the bumper, and a plug relocation plate. Now from your CTX kit, you're going to need your winch controller bracket, as well as your fair lead spacer if you are using a steel cable roller style fair lead. A few of the bolts out of your winch controller bag, and then 1 of the button head bolts with a washer will also be needed for your small ground. Tools needed for this install are going to be a T20, T25, and T30 bit or T-handle. A bit driver kit is useful but not necessary. A 3/8 drive with a 6-inch extension and a 3-inch extension. A 1/4 drive ratchet with an extension, as well as a swivel and a T30 bit. A 15, 13, 10, and 8mm socket are all useful. A pocket screwdriver, as well as a 4mm hex key and a 6mm hex key will be needed. A torque wrench, a pair of 13mm wrenches, and a pair of pliers will round out our tools. First thing we're gonna do is remove the controller head off of the winch itself to relocate this inside of the CTX bumper. First thing we're going to do is remove this bolt on the top here. This is gonna be a T25. And this is just a self-tapper into plastic, so it may be a little stiff coming out. So we're just gonna pivot that up out of the way, and we're gonna set this aside. We won't be reusing this piece with the relocation kit. Next, we need to knock these 3 13mm nuts off. We should just be able to break those loose and then spin them out by hand. And we'll set those 3 nuts aside. We will be reusing these. So next thing for removing the top hat controller is we're going to remove these 2 screws here. There's also 2 on the back side of this controller. Now Warren will tell you to disengage the winch lock and run the cable all the way out, which does work. However, if you have something like a bit driver kit, something similar to this tool is great for getting these bolts out. Now, this makes it a good bit easier to handle the winch with all the wire and cabling still coiled up, and not having to try and install this with all of the cabling stretched out. It is something that you can install on our bumper with the cable run all the way out. It is just a little bit more time intensive when it comes to handling the winch with the cable all the way out. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove these 2 bolts fully from the top hat. You should just be able to break them loose and then kind of turn them out with your fingertip. And then we're gonna flip the winch over and get the 2 on the backside. And then these 2 on the backside are a bit easier to get with an extension and a swivel, but same thing. You should just be able to break them loose and then spin them out by hand. A T-handle could also work on these to remove those. And now that we have those out, I'm gonna go ahead and keep a hand on my top hat as I rotate the winch back up. And then we can go ahead and carefully lift our controller pack off of the winch. Got my controller box here. We're actually gonna flip this thing upside down. You can see we got a bunch of screws in the bottom of this that we're going to remove to get to the actual guts of the controller. We're gonna take a T30 bit or T-handle, and we're going to remove these 4 outermost screws from the box, and that will separate our base plate from the top cover. And with that last bolt out, we can now separate our base plate from the top hat. We do want to be careful when doing this, as there are still some wires that are connected to the top hat itself that we will need to remove from inside. So that's our winch controller. You can see we have a connector here. This is for your winch controller remote. We're actually going to remove these 2 button head screws here and remove the entire harness out of the top hat. That's one. And we'll set these 2 screws aside as we will be reusing them. Now, if you notice, our plug is going to come out from the outside of the harness. So we're going to need to remove these 3 colored wires and your 1 red wire from your module itself. So I'm gonna take a pocket screwdriver and I'm just gonna pry very gently on the edge of this connector until we can slot our spade connectors off. And it's good to note the order that these colors come off. So white is on your 1 pin, brown is on your 2 pin, and green is on your 3 pin. I recommend taking a picture of the top of this hat before you start removing the spades, just in case you need to reference the order of colors again. So with those 3 off, we can just go ahead and remove this 1 bolt here, which will remove our red ring terminal from the controller. Next, I'm gonna grab a 13 and we're just going to break that nut loose. You should be able to back it off by hand once it's loose. And just slot that out of the way. And we're going to remove this ring terminal here, and you'll notice your positive power lead is going to come out as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and push our small ring terminal back through and set this wire to the side. So with these out, we can go ahead and pull this plug connector the rest of the way through the hat. And we'll set this to the side. Last thing we need to do to our hat before we get rid of it is we're going to take this rubber cover here and we're going to pop this tab with the notch back through the housing, as we're going to reuse this rubber cover on the plug. A little bit of push on the back side and some tug, and that comes right out, and we'll set the top hat to the side. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the last 2 bolts holding the actual module to the base plate. You're gonna have 2 nylock nuts. These are a 10 mil, and then you will also have 2 T30s on the back side. I like to set it over on its side, kind of like that, and go ahead and back those out. Just like that, our controller module is removed from the base plate. We can go ahead and set the base plate and all of that hardware to the side. We won't be reusing that. Last thing we need to do is remove these copper contacts off of the control box here. We're going to replace these with those leads we just installed on the winch. So these are gonna be a 13 for all 3 of these. Again, we can just bust them loose and back them off by hand. Already gone ahead and cracked these guys loose. And with that last contact removed, I'm just gonna go ahead and put the bolts back on. before we go and mount this to our controller plate. So I've got my winch controller plate here, and as you can see, there's a few different sets of holes to accommodate a bunch of different mounting positions. So with the Warn winches, I like to put it on this outside-most small hole. Now, some of the Warn winches will have an additional box on the back here, so if you do need a little bit more room, you can mount it at the front. However, if we mount at the front, you will need to wire up all of your lead connections first and then mount this to the control box. Whereas if you're mounting in the outermost position, you can go ahead and mount this to your control plate and then wire in your leads under the car. So I've gone ahead and got our controller mounted here. It's a little bit more time consuming with one person. If you do have a friend around to hold this in place while you tighten these, it does make it a little bit easier. But we've got this mounted now, so we can go ahead and get our relocation harness for our plug installed on this side of the controller. So we're gonna grab our small cable here, our relocation cable. You'll notice one side has the female spade terminals and one side has the male spade terminals. We're gonna go ahead and put these female sides back on the controller pack with the same order of colors that we did when we removed it, as well as the one ring terminal on this topmost pole. So before I put my ring terminal on, I'm gonna go ahead and grab my power lead we removed earlier, and I'm gonna go ahead and remove the nut and bolt combo that is holding it to this little copper contact. It makes an L. We're just gonna set that to the side along with the hardware. We won't need that anymore. And we're also going to take the top hat grommet off of that cable. And we're gonna go ahead and slot that onto this topmost one here. I'm gonna slot my ring terminal on and then drop my crush washer on and reinstall that nut. And I am going to tighten this down fully. It's gonna be a 13, and I'm just gonna tighten this down until it's good and snug, just like that. And we can go ahead and get this piece down under the car and start plugging in the rest of our harness. We're gonna go ahead and set this winch on our winch plate and get it partially bolted down. Next, we're gonna take one of our nylock nuts and we're going to slot it in the gap at the bottom of the winch. You'll notice that it pretty much perfectly slots up in there. And then you're going to take one of the bolts provided by T-sportline, and we're just gonna go ahead and get this front edge lined up, and we just wanna start it hand tight. This is just to keep the winch from falling off of the plate so that we can pivot this out like this to be able to attach our ground cable in the rear as well as route the relocation harness. So now that we've got this one hand tight in, we're gonna go ahead and pivot our winch out and put the remaining nylock nuts in the feet of the winch. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and hook up our negative ground cable. There is a stud on the back side lower of the winch that has a nut on it. It's a 13, and we're going to go ahead and bust that loose and take that and the washers off of that stud. And then we're going to take our ground cable and we're just gonna go ahead and get that bolted back into place. And we're gonna go ahead and tighten that down fully.
All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm showing that when we're putting the ground wire on, which is happening in the video when Connor has basically one bolt in and the winch is pivoted, instead of just adding the ground wire, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add the ground wire and then this small ground from the relocation kit that has the extra piece that we're gonna use the solder butt joint on. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our ground pull bolt, put it in right there, and then as usual, we can fasten our ground tighten it accordingly. So this ground is gonna end up going to your battery, and this is gonna go to your controller bracket or spliced with the old wire harness.
And then we're gonna take our negative cable, the other end, we're gonna slot it through our bumper, down the side of the bracket, and pull the rest of our length through. And then we're good to position our winch back. Now we wanna be careful and mindful of our Bluetooth harness here, as we're just going to slide this back and not pinch that. Now we're gonna go ahead and put the other 3 bolts holding the bottom of our winch in. And I'm gonna get all 4 of these started hand tight before I tighten them down fully. And once we have all 4 started, we're gonna go ahead and tighten them down and torque them to 38 foot-pounds. Torque spec is going to be 38 foot-pounds on these bolts. So I have my Zeon relocation kit here. This is gonna be the next piece to go on our install. So we're gonna go ahead and take the tail end of our wires and we're gonna run those the same way that our negative cable went. And we're just gonna tuck those back in. And then we're going to take our top lead and slot that on top of the studs on top of our winch there, where our controller mounted up and in. Give those a little bit of help getting down, just like that. And then we're gonna take those 3 nuts we removed earlier and go ahead and put those back on these 3. So now that we're under the car, we're going to take these 3 leads coming off of our winch and we're actually going to route them up over our CTX support bracket towards the center of the vehicle. And we're gonna keep our negative lead off to the side. We will run this once we get our control box up here. We'll run this and the power wire at the same time. So I'm gonna hop back up to the table and grab our braided sheathing, and it's gonna go around these 3 leads right here up top where it contacts the support bracket. So I have my wire sheathing here, and it does have a little bit of stretch to it like this, so we're just going to pop our ends open and slot our 3 leads through that and run it back to the position that we want it at. And we're just gonna leave it loose for right now. When we come back to button up our wire routing fully, we'll throw some zip ties around either side of this so that it doesn't shift. But we're able to go grab our control box now and get these 3 cables wired up. So I've got my controller box here and we're about ready to hook up our leads. So your leads are color coded and they will have a letter or a letter number combo on them. It's going to go A, which is your yellow one, F1, the green labeled one, and then F2, the blue labeled one. So we're gonna go ahead and get these bolted down and tightened up fully, and then we can route our power lead and our plug relocation. I find it easy to start with F1, your green one. Just kind of gets buried by the other 2 wires if we aren't careful. So we'll get that one on with a crush washer and the nut, and then we will get this tightened down. Next, I'm gonna move on to F2, our blue lead. That's gonna sit on the terminal pretty much right below our power terminal. We're just gonna slot that on, throw a crush washer on and one of the nuts, and also tighten this one down fully. Last one we're gonna hook up is our yellow A. That's gonna go on this last pole at the top. We're just gonna get this guy slotted in. Just about like that, with a washer and a nut. And tighten that down fully. And we can just let this kind of sit up on its own right there. And we can go ahead and grab some bolts to mount our control pack. I'm gonna take my plug relocation harness here and I'm gonna route it underneath the yellow A cable and around the front side of our plate so that it comes out of this notch right here. So our Warn winches are going to mount on the driver's side of the vehicle. So we can kind of set it up there and get an idea on how that's going to sit up there. You'll have a couple of mounting spots, front and to the side, to go ahead and set this up in here. So I'm going to take our relocation harness here and route it up over our support bracket here as I set this up. A little bit easier to route it now. Before we bolted this in, got a little bit more space. And then we can go ahead and get a couple of our bolts started. Maybe easier to have a friend hold this up. Kind of just like that. And we can go ahead and route the rest of our wires now. So now that I've got our control plate here bolted, I've gone ahead and routed our power wire through this wire sheathing we went ahead and put on earlier. And I'm just going to take this, kind of tuck it up around the wires coming through this channel in our support bracket here to keep them from wearing through. Then I'm going to take our power lead and run it up over our support bracket so that it pairs up with our negative cable. And then we can run these up to our frunk where our battery is located. But first I want to take and finish up our plug relocation harness here. You'll see we got 3 male spade connectors and 1 stripped power connector. So we're actually going to clip the ring terminal off of our other connector and put a provided solder joint over this. And then these 3 spade terminals will plug into our plug harness, and they are color matching, white to white, green to green, brown to brown. We're gonna grab our plug relocation bracket. It'll sit on the car about like this. And it's got a couple different holes in here for a couple different types of winches. Our Zeon winch is going to mount with the flat side up, and it's going to use the larger of the 2 sets of holes. And we're going to use the button heads we removed from the plug initially, as well as the 5mm nylocks from the CTX kit. So I'm gonna grab a T25 and an 8mm, and we're just gonna tighten these down. They don't have to be super cranked down, just snugged up. And we'll do that for both of these, just like that. And then we can go ahead and take our bracket and mount this up in the car. It's going to go in these 2 nutserts in the crush bar on the bumper. And we're going to use 2 of the button head M6s from your CTX kit. So we're gonna take our wires here and we're going to feed these down between the winch plate. And we're gonna go ahead and get these bolted in. So now I'm gonna take our rubber connector plug that we pulled off of our top hat, and this is just going to slot on over that connector, just like that. So we can head back down under the car now and go ahead and hook our plug to our relocation harness. So I'm gonna go ahead and hook up our spade terminals now. So we're gonna go white to white, and then we will do brown to brown, and then green to green. And then we can go ahead and connect these with our solder joint terminal. Then we will take our small gauge ground wire and cut off the ring terminal on the controller side. The wire can be spliced to the extended ground wire we put on the post of the winch.
All right, so real quick, I'm gonna demonstrate how to use one of these solder butt joints. Essentially, say we have our wire that we want to clip off, take a tool, cut off the connector. You can use this blade or sharp edge tool to pry off the insulation, or a specialty tool like this to reveal the metal. We'll then take a solder butt joint and slide it on. and our corresponding wire. We'll have the metal meet in the middle, and the solder will go right over where the two are meeting. Then take your heat source and start heating the ends. The tubing will shrink around your wire. I like to heat one end and the other end and the center. The solder will melt, creating a strong bond from wire to wire. So I ended up hitting it with a little more heat, and you can see we are firmly wrapped around the wire, and the solder in the joint is melted around the wire, creating a strong bond.
So I've gone ahead and tucked our wiring harness back over this support bracket into our control box mount. With that all done, we can go ahead and tighten this box down fully. You're gonna need a couple 13mm wrenches and then a 13mm socket on an extension. And I like to do these side ones first, and we're just going to tighten these down nice and snug. Move on to our rear one. And then we'll do our front post. And with that, our front control box is all mounted up. We can go ahead and route our power and ground leads. So we're gonna take our power and ground leads and we're gonna run them up the side of the radiator, kind of through the fender well, and there will be a gap on the side here between the frame rail and the radiator. And that's where we're going to run our power and ground leads. I like to start with my ground. Let's see if I can fish this up. Sometimes it's better to have a friend that is up top that is able to grab the wire as you are feeding it upwards. And I'm gonna go ahead and slide up top and pull that the rest of the way through. So I've got our wires routed through the front here. We've got a lot of wires kind of hanging out here. We got a bunch of different lights going on this bumper, but for the gist of it, you're going to take your leads and run them up the side of the radiator and then back towards your cabin filter. And you're gonna leave them right there. And we'll go ahead and put our frunk back in. We're gonna go ahead and take those and just set our cables through. Just like that. Okay, and we can hold. So I've gone ahead and wired up our winch. You can see our negative lead here and our power lead here. It's hooked up to our external battery system. If you are getting a CTX bumper with a winch, you will get this battery system with your kit. For installation instructions, please refer to the video on our channel. Now that we've got everything wired up, it's a great idea to go ahead and test our winch before we assemble any of the rest of the bumper. So I've got our controller here plugged into our controller port. And I'm just gonna go ahead and extend it out a little bit so we can get this to our lead. Look at that, winch works just as expected. So now that we know that this works, we can go ahead and move on to our fair lead and cleaning up our wiring harness. So since we're using a roller style lead with our steel cable winch, we're gonna need our flush spacer plate for our CTX front bumper. Just gonna slot in place like that. And then our fair lead's gonna go on top, but we will need to put it all on as one giant assembly. For this fair lead, we will use the supplied 30mm button head and washer. However, with different fair lead combinations, we may need to adjust the bolt size to ensure that we minimize the amount of threads extending past the welded nut. We include a 20mm and 16mm bolts for cases in which there is too much thread extending past the fishing. Go ahead and get these started on both sides. Get them pretty snug, and then we're gonna square everything up and tighten it down. And we're just gonna get these good and snug. It's going to be a 6mm Allen. And with that, we are good to reinstall our bumper. Go ahead and feed our winch cable through and put our hook on the end of that. So I've got my hook here. It's gonna have this pin at the end. This may be bent out. You can take a pair of pliers and bend it back straight. And then we're going to take and remove this pin fully. And then we can slot our safety pin out, slot it back through around our winch cable, and then put our pin back through. we're gonna take and bend our tab, starting with the longer side, and then our shorter side, we will do the same, just like that, and it can't come out. And that is our hook all installed. That's gonna wrap it up for our Warn Zeon 12 winch install. If you like what you see, leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to leave a comment down below. See you next time.